may be seated. Welcome back to the members of the jury. Detective, you're still on the oath, and Mr. Ellis, you may continue.
We were discussing the CAD entry at 6:23 p.m. and we had just discussed your views on what aggravated battery is, and now I'd like to continue our discussion on the information that was contained on the CAD entry at 6:23. Now it says extensive criminal history.
Yes.
Based on your training and experience, how would extensive criminal history be interpreted?
More than one police report, reporting this type of history.
And with regard to various jurisdictions, what does that mean?
Not just within the Albuquerque Police Department.
So it's fair to say that Mr. Boyd had committed aggravated battery on a peace officer with other law enforcement agencies.
According to this CAD, that is what would be interpreted.
Okay. Now, there's also the statement, it has been reported that he is paranoid schizophrenic. Do you see that?
Yes.
Now, you would agree with me that a CIT officer could use that information to make certain assessments about how to talk to Mr. Boyd?
Yes.
And so this information is important for those individuals who have the training and experience on how to address and speak with someone who has paranoid schizophrenia.
Yes.
Now, there's also a statement here. It says, he is a transient that is known to frequent public libraries. Why is that important for an officer to know that particular bit of information?
I think the fact that he's transient means that he doesn't have a house, he's not living anywhere. Sometimes if we contact an individual, say up in the mountains like that or in the open space area, but they live at a certain residence or if family is discovered, then perhaps there's ways of trying to communicate with family to see if there's anything that can be done to resolve the situation. But because it's saying he's transient, then that's just saying he's not, that option's not really there.
The next statement is, use extreme caution when contacting James. Do you see that?
Yes.
Based on your training and experience, how is a police officer with the Albuquerque Police Department trained to essentially assess and take the next steps after learning that the person that they're dealing with, that they should use extreme caution when contacting them?
Again, it goes back to police officers contact multiple people throughout the city on a daily basis. And again, most of those contacts are very casual, just like any other contact between one person and another. However, when you have knowledge that someone, like with this statement, and they're telling you to use caution when contacting him or contacting James, then you wouldn't just go up and shake his hand and approach him like you would any other person because of the possibility that violence may occur.
Now I'm going to turn your attention to the information that is the history from 6:30 that day, 6:30 p.m. Now, first, I'd like to ask you, who is the person providing the information that we're going to talk about subsequently?
Again, it's the officer that's up in the Real-Time Crime Center. RC35 is the call sign.
Now, do you happen to know, based on your investigation, do you happen to know the name of that individual?
I believe it was Officer Luthi.
Okay. Is that someone who's a certified law enforcement officer?
Yes.
Okay. Now, turning your attention to this particular statement, what is a web query?
Web query is one of the many databases that we have to run police reports, past police reports. There's various different ways that you can run those reports by running someone's name or running a case number or something to that effect.
The next statement is, I've located numerous 16s. What's 16s?
16 is the 10 code for arrest.
Okay. So there's criminal damage. What is that?
Criminal damage is whenever somebody damages property that does not belong to them, whether it be public property or private property.
And then there's ag battery against MDC 34. What does that mean?
MDC is the Metropolitan Detention Center. 34 is officer, so what they're referring to there is a guard at the Metropolitan Detention Center, and that there was an arrest or a charge at one point in time for an aggravated battery against an MDC guard.
So is it correct to say that this bit of information is communicating that at one time James Boyd was arrested for the crime of aggravated battery against a corrections officer who worked at the Metropolitan Detention Center?
That's what it says.
And just to be clear, the Metropolitan Detention Center is the jail for Bernalillo County.
Yes, whenever someone is arrested within Bernalillo County, that is where they are booked.
Now, there's a case with a number that follows it. Do you see that?
Yes.
Now, if an officer is at his MDT mobile, I think it's MDT, right?
Yes.
What ability do they have to actually look at the police report?
As it pertains to the Albuquerque police reports, they can very quickly pull up any past police report that has already been submitted and approved by a sergeant and is in the system for public access.
So is it fair to say that, for example, when there's a case number here for an Albuquerque Police Department report, it's simply a hyperlink to that report?
Yes.
Now, in your investigation of this case, did you verify that there in fact was an arrest for aggravated battery against an MDC corrections officer?
There was a charge. I mean, he was already...
Excuse me, Your Honor, I'm going to object in the first place.
And then you see the statement and APD 34s. Do you see that?
Yes.
What does that mean?
So going back to the whole sentence, aggravated battery against MDC 34 gives the case number and APD 34, so Albuquerque Police Department officers, and it gives the case number for that incident.
Now, there's also 40 TOT for attempting to unlawfully enter a military base. What does that mean?
So 40 TOT, again, 1040 mental patient means that he was transported to a hospital for a mental evaluation, whether it was a voluntary or not voluntary, that would have been deemed there at the scene. And it was because he was attempting to enter onto a military base where he did not have access.
And because there's a case number there, is it fair to say that the military base that Mr. Boyd was trying to enter was within the city of Albuquerque, the city limits of the city of Albuquerque?
Based on this case number, it appears so.
Now, does an officer have the discretion to take someone who they believe to be mentally ill to receive mental health care services as opposed to arresting them?
If the officer deems that that is the necessary thing that has to happen, yes, that is a possibility.
I'd like to turn your attention to what occurred at 6:59 p.m. Would you please tell us who was the source of this comment and what the comment means?
Source of the comment 754 was K-9 Officer Scott Weimerskirch. He's saying subject still highly irate, talks about 27-1ing 34s, and 27-1 is the code we refer to for homicide/murder. So when someone is saying 27-1ing, then they're referring to talks about killing. 34s officers, and making other 1040 comments. Again, officers would take that as he's making comments out of the ordinary that maybe delusional comments that don't make sense.
So, based on this information, an officer who is to review it would know that Mr. Boyd is making statements about killing or murdering officers, is that right?
Yes.
In addition to making, Mr. Boyd making statements that, for whatever reason, the officer suggested that Mr. Boyd was mentally ill.
Yes.
Now, in your experience, how common is it to have someone making overt threats to kill law enforcement officers?
It's not uncommon when amongst certain types of people.
Is it, in your experience, common for the mentally ill to make threats like that against the police?
No, not uncommon.
Okay. You would agree with me that, in your experience, that dealing with the mentally ill and having worked with them, that they, for the most part, are no more violent than anyone else. You would agree with that?
That's true.
And it's only a very small segment of the mentally ill population that poses a officer safety risk to officers. Is that right?
That is true.
But you would agree with me that those who are mentally ill and violent are unpredictable.
That is true.
And it's that unpredictability that makes them as dangerous as they are.
That's right.
I'd like to turn your attention to what was the comments that were made at 7:06. Who made that statement, and what does it mean?
Again, 754, that's going to be Officer Scott Weimerskirch, and he's saying negotiations are not productive. He was, again, the primary person after McCall Monet that was having actual verbal communication with James Boyd.
Now I'd like to turn your attention to what was happening at 7:28. Who was making the comment, and what does the comment mean?
Again, 754, K-9 Officer Scott Weimerskirch saying subject not compliant with 34's officer's commands, wants to walk downhill with his bags.
Now, based on your investigation, what did you conclude about why the terms by which the officers would allow Mr. Boyd to walk down the hill?
He had to relinquish his knives, not merely just put them in his pockets, he had to put them on the ground.
Okay. Based on your investigation, what did you learn about the success of the officers' efforts to convince Mr. Boyd to relinquish his knives so that he could walk down the hill?
He never put his knives on the ground. He never relinquished the knives.
Now, during this time, not only were there the radio tapes, but also Officer Weimerskirch had his video camera running.
Yes.
And you would agree with me that Acting Sergeant Ingram also had his belt tape recorder running.
Yes.
Those three sources of information provided you with essentially a running history of the interactions that occurred between not only Mr. Boyd and the officers, but among the officers. Is that fair to say?
Yes.
All of the interactions that, for example, Officer Weimerskirch, Officer Ingram, and Detective Sandy had were all recorded.
Yes.
And you were able to sort of look at all of these recordings and make assessments about what was happening.
Yes.
You would agree with me, based on your review of the APD radio tape, that Sergeant Fox had asked Officer Weimerskirch to develop a plan to take Mr. Boyd into custody before dark.
I believe that's correct.
Now, this hasn't come up quite yet, but would you please explain Sergeant Fox's role at this particular point in the incident?
Again, Sergeant Fox was part of the SWAT team. He had arrived on scene shortly before everything happened. And it's his role, his responsibility to come up with eventually start coming up with a tactical plan in conjunction with his team leader, which is Ramon Onelis. And they are the ones that will eventually kind of assume command of the scene and actually start issuing orders to the other members of the SWAT team and telling where other field officers need to be positioned as far as perimeter positions.
You would agree, according to your investigation, that Sergeant Fox only asked Officer Weimer-Skirch and no one else to develop a plan to take Mr. Boyd into custody?
Yes.
Now, based on your investigation, did Officer Weimer-Skirch develop a plan?
Again, like I had said, there was plans that had been discussed, but I could never really discern if a finalized plan was ever really put into, was ever come up with.
Okay. Based on your investigation, why was nightfall an issue with regards to taking Mr. Boyd into custody?
Nightfall was an issue in the foothills due to the fact that unlike an urban environment like the city, there were no street lights, there were no other kind of like maybe house lights that would give light and allow officers to see much past 10 or 20 feet without the use of their night vision goggles, and also due to the fact that with the terrain, the fact that there were large boulders, big bushes that could be hidden, where people could hide, and that the fact that James Boyd would not be able to be seen if he started moving around in the area of his camp, even though they had a loose perimeter around it.
To the extent that Officer Weimer-Skirch developed a plan, you would agree that there is nothing in your investigation that shows that Officer Weimer-Skirch communicated that plan on the radio?
No.
And you would agree with me that there's no evidence uncovered in your investigation that Officer Perez was ever told by anyone what plan, if any, Officer Weimer-Skirch may have developed?
That's correct.
And you would agree with me that on the when in terms of radio dispatch traffic, that is the radio communications that were taking place, there was nothing there that would inform anyone who was listening what Officer Weimer-Skirch's plan, if any, actually was?
That's correct.
You also would agree with me that you found no evidence in your investigation that anyone, that includes Detective Sandy, Officer Weimer-Skirch, and Acting Sergeant Ingram, ever directly communicated with Officer Perez during this incident, I should say, before the shooting occurred?
That's correct. There was no communication between those three and Officer Perez.
And it's correct to say that Officer Perez did not arrive at this location, or I should say, in the area where the incident was happening till about 7-11, is that right?
It's approximately around there.
And you would agree with me that what's shown on Officer Perez's helmet camera basically, for the most part, shows everything that happened once Officer Perez had arrived to that bottom of the hill where Mr. Boyd was located?
Correct. He turned on his helmet camera basically right at the time when he reached the area where he could actually start providing assistance to those officers.
And you would agree with me that nowhere on Officer Perez's helmet camera is there any communication from any officer as to what those officers are going to do next?
No.
And so it's fair to say that, based on your investigation, that Officer Perez had no information from those officers about the plan that Officer Weimer-Skirch may have developed?
That's correct. Those officers were actually unaware that Officer Perez was there.
Now I'd like to talk to you about your review of all the audio and videotapes and make some assessments really about some of the things that were said. Now, during your investigation, of course, you learned that Mr. Boyd was told or ordered to drop his knives. Is that right?
Yes, he was.
And based on your review of that evidence, you would agree with me that Officer Hernandez and Officer McDaniel ordered Mr. Boyd to drop his knives approximately 25 times.
That sounds about right.
The patrol officers, meaning Sergeant Jason Carpenter, Officers Niprath, Monet, Rogelio, and Wetterlin ordered Mr. Boyd to drop his knives 3 times.
Sounds about right.
And Officer Weimer-Scourge ordered or asked Mr. Boyd to drop his knives 5 times.
That sounds about right.
Is it a fair approximation to say that Mr. Boyd was asked approximately 33 times to drop his knives?
That sounds approximately correct.
Now, during your investigation, is it correct to say that you were able to determine how many times officers asked Mr. Boyd to keep his hands out of his pocket?
Yes.
Now, you would agree with me that the purpose of asking Mr. Boyd to keep his hands out of his pocket is an officer's safety reason, isn't that right?
Yes, all officers are trained in the academy to ask people to keep their hands out of their pockets, because we're trained that the majority of people, when they're carrying weapons, will carry them in their pockets. So we always like to see the hands. And also they had knowledge that the very weapons in question were in Mr. Boyd's pockets.
Now, in your review of all the video and audio tapes, would you agree with me that the patrol officers who negotiated with Mr. Boyd asked Mr. Boyd 11 times to keep his hands out of his pockets?
That sounds about right.
And you would agree with me that Mr. Boyd refused to do what those officers had asked him, that is, keep his hands out of his pockets?
It sounded like that was the case. Again, it was hard to say because not all of the video actually showed James Boyd's actions, so I couldn't tell if he was actually taking his hands out of his pockets or if he wasn't.
Now, in your review of all the videos and the audios, you would agree with me that Mr. Boyd threatened to kill the officers?
Yes, he did.
And he used specifically the word kill, is that right?
Yes,
Mr. Boyd threatened to kill officers Hernandez and McDaniel 3 times.
it sounds about right.
And Mr. Boyd threatened to kill the patrol officers at least once.
Yes,
And Mr. Boyd threatened to kill Officer Weimer-Scourge approximately 15 times, is that right?
sounds about right.
All right. And it would be a fair approximation to say that Mr. Boyd threatened to kill the officers approximately 19 times.
That sounds about right.
Okay. Is that a fair estimate in your view?
Yes, again, in my mind, I don't have every single one counted, but I've gone over the tapes enough to know that that's approximately correct.
Okay. Now I'd like to ask you about the efforts that Mr. Boyd made to surrender to law enforcement. Now, in your review of the evidence in this case, right before Mr. Boyd was shot, did Mr. Boyd ever make any verbal statement that indicated that he was going to surrender?
Not that he was going to surrender, no.
Okay. Mr. Boyd never said, "I give up."
No,
Mr. Boyd never said, "I'll drop the knives."
no,
Mr. Boyd didn't say, "Stop."
no,
You would agree with me that Mr. Boyd never said a word to the officers during that final confrontation that would suggest that he was attempting to surrender?
he said something, but it didn't have anything to do with surrender, I don't believe.
Now, you would agree with me that before Mr. Boyd was shot, he did not exhibit any physical gesture that suggested he was surrendering.
No, not at all.
Mr. Boyd never put up his hands.
No,
And you would agree with me, based on your training and experience, that when suspects surrender to the police, oftentimes they will show their hands.
yes,
That is something I think that the culture that we live in has taught people to do when they're surrendering to the police.
Question, speculation, Your Honor.
yes,
Now, did Mr. Boyd ever drop his knives?
never,
No, he didn't put his knives away before the final frames when he was shot.
no,
Mr. Boyd didn't drop to his knees.
no,
And you would agree with me that Mr. Boyd never made any physical gesture that based on your investigation, suggested that he was surrendering.
not at all.
Now, you would agree with me that in your review of the radio tapes, no officer ever made a radio dispatch that he believed or she believed that Mr. Boyd was surrendering.
No,
And you would agree with me that there wasn't a single interview that you took or a single interview that you reviewed where there was an officer who said, "I believe Mr. Boyd was surrendering before he was shot."
that's correct. Nobody said that.
Now I'd like to review some of the incidents in which Mr. Boyd made threats to the law enforcement officers. And with the court's permission, I would like to play Exhibit B3A and the transcript, which is, I believe, B4A.
Are these the same items that were played in the same statement, Your Honor?
Yes.
Any objection? It's up to you. You may play.
What times? Just cite the times. Yeah, all right. The time that will be played is 12:27 through 12:50. Now, the state police officer that Mr. Boyd is referring to is who?
I'm sorry, what was that?
Mr. Boyd is referring to a state police officer in that particular segment?
Yes, I believe Officer Mitch Bankston.
And in your review of the negotiations which Officer Mitch Bankston had with Mr. Boyd, did your review reveal anything that Mitch Bankston said or did that made Mr. Boyd angry?
Again, I know when he would talk about the fact that he needed to relinquish his knives, that would make Mr. Boyd angry.
Okay. I'd now like to play from that same video, or exhibit B3B, along with the transcript, and this would be from the 3:10 to 3:59.
Where's your family? That's none of your goddamn business. That's my business, their business. Okay. Okay, what? Roll the sun down. It's God that stops the sun. The sunset belongs to God, man. I'll kill you in the dark if you try to harm me. Now walk out of here. Don't give a fuck. I cry no more forever right here. You know what that means? Means you've already fucking murdered me, man. Your life is at stake. My name.
Now, you would agree with me that Mr. Boyd's voice is loud in this audio?
Your Honor, I'm going to object. I think the tape speaks for itself.
Okay.
To have detectives don't count on the tape, I think it's cumulative.
Yes, it's loud.
And approximately, when this tape was being recorded, approximately, and again, I guess that shows my age, tape, it's a video, digital file, never mind. That happens too frequently. How far away was Mr. Boyd from Officer Weimerskirch at the time this video was made?
I couldn't guess on the distance because I don't have real good video showing where they're at.
Okay. But this is further, you would agree with me that this is further down the hill than that point in time when the officers tried to close the distance on Mr. Boyd and make the arrest?
Yes, it was down the hill. I mean, it was more than 10, probably 20 feet.
Okay. What I'd like to do now is, from the same exhibit, B3B, and along with the transcript, would like to play minutes 16:15 through 16:21.
Drop the knife, man, and come down here. I'm dropping up your ass, man. Oh, come on. Stop your neck.
Now, you would agree with me that Mr. Boyd said that he would drop a knife into Officer Weimerskirch's neck.
That's correct.
And yesterday we took a look at Officer Weimerskirch's photograph, is that right?
Yes.
And you would agree with me that Officer Weimerskirch had no protection for his neck?
No.
Officer Weimerskirch had body armor that he's required to wear,
Yes.
and that's soft body armor, is that right?
That's correct.
And you would agree with me that soft body armor is not designed to protect an officer from edged weapons.
That's correct.
From the same exhibit, I would like to play minute 1829 through 1943, along with the running transcript, with the court's permission.
Put down those weapons, man. You don't tell me to put down my arms. Well, I'm not talking to you until you do. My arms are to protect the officer. Okay, I'm not talking to you until you put those down first. If somebody's dying tonight, it ain't gonna be me. Okay, well, we can't do this, man. We're not gonna do this. We're not a team, man. You ain't my team. I mean, not with you. You was murderers and rapists, right? I'm saying you listening, you saying what is? Sure ain't, because you keep trying to get near to death, man. Why you approaching death? Why you approaching getting killed together? You want to approach getting killed together? You understand it means you'll get killed together and I'll walk out of here from the same world for 2 or 3 days. I'll come back up here and fix dead bodies for 2 or 3 days, man. You don't understand that. I'm not supposed to be killed because I want to, man. More hoes, more kids, more make love, more rich family. More kids, critters, murderers, rapists. Why should I have to kill you? Because you're doing shit like that, trying to murder me. That's why I got to kill you tonight. You want to die tonight? That's what you approach.
Subject power agitated, keeps pulling the knife out of his right pocket.
You need to push the power to arrest. You're approaching death tonight. Ain't my fault.
Is it correct to say that your investigation revealed that Mr. Boyd's death threats were serious?
Yes, they were.
Did your investigation reveal that Mr. Boyd made these death threats while he was armed?
Yes, he did.
Did your investigation reveal any evidence which suggested that Mr. Boyd would not carry out his death threats?
No, I did not find any evidence that he wouldn't.
You would agree with me that your investigation revealed that Mr. Boyd made legitimate threats to kill the officers who tried to negotiate with him?
Yes, he did.
Now I'd like to turn your attention to the arrival of Officer Perez. First, it'd be fair to say that Officer Perez arrived at about 7:11, more or less.
Somewhere around there.
And when did the officer-involved shooting of Mr. Boyd take place? And I think we have the CAD to help you with that.
So the shots fired were called out by actual Sergeant, SWAT Sergeant Jim Fox. That's his call sign, 710. And it was called out at 1933 hours, which is 7:33, but it had occurred a couple minutes prior to this.
So just going back, Officer Hernandez and Officer McDaniel, they were dispatched at 4:30. Is that right?
Yes.
And until and again, just simple math, the incident, or I should say, the shooting happened at 7:30.
Approximately, yes.
So this incident, based on the information collected in the CADs, took place over the course of 3.5 hours.
Approximately, yes.
And Officer Perez, however, unlike the other officers who were there, in the early hours, Officer Perez was there at the scene for only 20 minutes before the incident took place.
Correct.
Now, based on your investigation, you would agree that Mr. Boyd had demonstrated his intent to kill law enforcement officers.
Yes.
Mr. Boyd had demonstrated his intent to kill Officer Weimer-Skirch.
Yes.
And your investigation revealed that Officer Weimer-Skirch was the closest officer to Mr. Boyd at the time the shots were fired.
Yes.
You would agree with me, based on your investigation, that Mr. Boyd, when he was shot and killed, had 2 knives in his possession.
That's correct.
Those knives are deadly weapons.
Yes, they are.
Those knives can be used to stab or cut an officer,
Yes.
and that studying and cutting are serious physical injuries.
Yes.
And based on your investigation, you would agree with me that at the time Mr. Boyd had been shot, that he drew his knives and had them in his hands,
Yes, he did.
that Mr. Boyd drew his knives in a threatening, menacing manner,
Yes.
And you would agree with me that when it was be a reasonable interpretation of Mr. Boyd pulling out his knives, that he intended to use them?
Objection, Your Honor. What issue?
Yes.
You would agree that Officer Weimer-Skirch had put himself in a dangerous position.
Yes, he did.
Officer Weimer-Skirch closed the distance between himself and Mr. Boyd.
Yes, he did.
Officer Weimer-Skirch's decision to close the distance put himself in danger, is that right?
That's correct.
And at this time, Your Honor, I would like to play from the same exhibit that we've been referring to before, Exhibit B2C in this particular case, a portion of the video along with the running transcript, and that would be at 6 minutes, 31 seconds to 6 minutes and 41 seconds. In your investigation, did your review of Officer Weimer-Skirch's video reveal that what can be seen in that video is Mr. Boyd's lower body?
It was kind of hard to see on my screen. Could we play it again?
Well, we can play it again, or we can show you a screenshot, which I'd like to lay the foundation for.
No, Your Honor. Thank you, then.
We have an exhibit that's been marked B3C1, and I'd like to approach the witness, Your Honor. I'd like for you to take a moment.
Okay.
Do you recognize what has been placed in front of you?
Yes, it's a still photograph from Canine Officer Scott Weimer-Skirch's taser video.
And do you agree that that's a fair and accurate screenshot of the video that's actually shown in Officer Weimer-Skirch's from his video?
Yes.
Your Honor, at this time, we would like to move Exhibit B3C1 with evidence.
Any objection? Can I see it, Judge? Because the one we have is really blurry. Can I see the one that the guy admit, though? Does it look like this? See? Okay. No objection, Your Honor, although I will note that it's hard to discern anything in this particular. B3C1 is the study?
Would you please describe what is depicted in this video still?
It is a blurry video, but I can make out the police service dog, Scott Weimer-Skirch's police service dog, as well as the blue bag that was set in front of James Boyd. It appears to be James Boyd's legs, but this is a blurry photo. It is hard to tell.
Using the marking device on your screen, could you please identify for the jury, using the exhibit, what you're referring to?
Yes, so we're talking about the police service dog right here. The blue bag, this was actually when the dog did not do what the dog was supposed to do. The dog actually went after a blue bag that was near where James Boyd was, and you can see that right here. And then again right here, what it appears to be in the upper left-hand corner, James Boyd's legs.
Now, you had mentioned that this is unfortunately a pixelated, blurry video.
Yes.
And would it be helpful to show the video again?
Yes.
With the court's permission, I'd like to show the video again. Did you see the image that's described, that we had placed on the screen just now?
Yes,
And those, in fact, were James Boyd's legs?
yes, they were.
And that was the bag that Mr. Boyd was holding, that blue bag?
The blue bag, yes.
And then that is police service dog Rex, that's also in the video?
Yes.
May I take a moment to confer, Your Honor? Your Honor, I was reminded I failed to lay a proper foundation for another exhibit that will be used with another witness. I'd like to do that at this time. In your investigation, isn't it true that Sergeant Jason Carpenter had a video camera running during this incident?
Yes.
And as we had mentioned, as you had mentioned before in your testimony, that the way in which videos are kept, only a certain amount of time can be stored in the cloud, is that right?
Yes.
So that explains why certain videos have 3 parts.
Yes.
And in your investigation, you of course came to learn that Sergeant Jason Carpenter had 3 videos that were made of this incident.
Correct.
Now, have you had an opportunity to watch Exhibit B2A, Exhibit B2B, and Exhibit B2C, which are the 3 videos taken by Sergeant Jason Carpenter?
I have watched them, yes.
Now, in your review of those videos, did you recognize those videos to be videos of this incident involving Mr. Boyd?
Yes, they were.
And you were able to recognize the voices that you heard on that video as the voices of officers who you've come to learn and know through the course of this investigation?
Yes.
And when the video was created, was the video created contemporaneously with the incident that the camera was recording?
Yes.
Are these videos created by the Albuquerque Police Department officers kept in the regular course of business?
Yes.
Are the videos are the videos kept by the Albuquerque Police Department business records of the Albuquerque Police Department?
Yes.
And are those videos true and accurate video recordings of the encounter with Mr. James Boyd on March the 16th, 2014?
Yes, they are.
Although this witness won't testify about this video at this time, Your Honor, I would like the court to rule that the proper foundation has been laid for the admission of Sergeant Carpenter's videos into evidence.
I think the proper foundation is to Sergeant Carpenter. Because that's the only person who can identify that that's truly and accurately what he saw. So I think there is a business records foundation laid, that has been laid. And then I'll just reserve any objection for when it is actually offered with whatever witness will be played.
So the business record foundation has been laid before you know.
Now, you've also had an opportunity to review the transcripts that were made of Sergeant Carpenter's video, is that right?
Yes.
And you had an opportunity to review the transcripts for accuracy, is that right?
Yes.
So you compared the transcripts that were made with the audio that you can hear,
Yes.
and you would agree with me that the transcripts accurately record what was being said on the audio.
Yes.
And if you had any deletions, additions, or changes that you wanted to make, that opportunity,
Excuse me, Mr. Robles. We'll agree the transcript is accurate, so that Mr. Robles doesn't have to go through this foundation.
And what is this one?
they are our exhibits, Exhibit D4A, D4B, and D4C.
And you're saying D is in David?
Yes.
Is there a stipulation of the exhibits participant?
I'm going to wait to see their offices, but as far as accuracy of the transcript, they're accurate.
Those are my questions past the witness.
Afternoon, Detective.
Afternoon.
Detective, were you in the courtroom during the opening statements?
No, I was not.
Okay. So you didn't hear the prosecutor's opening statement?
No, I did not.
Okay. Let me ask you if you agree with the following statement regarding this case. Keith Sandy, he was not dispatched to the scene where this shooting took place, but overheard something on the radio and on his own assembled a team of his rope members and went out to the scene. Would you agree that that's truthful?
No, he was contacted by radio control.
Did you ever tell the prosecution that that was factually accurate?
I never discussed it with the prosecution.
Okay. How about this statement? This sniper could see Mr. Boyd never shot at any time during this. That's partially accurate, isn't that right?
He never shot.
Right, but he couldn't see Mr. Boyd the entire time, could he?
I don't believe he saw him the entire time.
Right. When Mr. Boyd was actually posing the threat that you testified to earlier, the sniper had already radioed to everybody saying, 22 is down, right?
That's correct.
And what does 22 is down mean? What does that mean?
It means he no longer is able to cover them, and that was due to the fact that they were in his line of sight.
Okay. Let me ask you if you believe that this is a true statement. And by the way, let me back up. Did you ever tell the prosecution, the state, the prosecutor's office, did you ever tell them that the sniper could see and could have taken a shot at the time that Mr. Boyd was shot?
No.
Okay. And by the way, just to say this again, but just to make sure, you were the lead case agent, and is it your belief that you know as much as anybody about this case?
I would hope so, yes.
Okay. So, talking about CIT officers,
Yes.
tell me if this statement is true about what was happening up there, including one more CIT officer, crisis intervention trains officer. He was actually the one who had been negotiating with Mr. Boyd. He too was sent away by defendant Sandy and the rope team when they arrived on the scene, rather than let him continue to talk to Mr. Boyd, but they sent him right away there. My question is that accurate? Is that a true statement that Keith Sandy and the rope team sent away the CIT officer?
No, the actual order came from SWAT officer Jeff McFarland.
So just to be clear, your last name is Stone, right?
Yes.
Thank you, Detective. It was McFarland ordered the CIT officer to come down, right?
Yes.
Not Keith Sandy, correct?
No, Keith Sandy did not get over the radio and say that.
In fact, Keith Sandy had nothing to do with any radio communication telling any officers to move off that hill, did he?
No.
And you believe that if he did, you'd know it, wouldn't you?
Yes.
Okay. I just walked that way. So, officer, I think you've seen this earlier, haven't you?
Yes.
This is a picture of all these officers, right?
Yes.
Now, one of them is Keith Sandy.
He's
correct?
underneath Jim Purdue.
Okay. Right here.
Yes.
Okay. With the exception of himself, of course. Did Mr. Sandy ever direct any of these officers on what they were supposed to do in any way on that hill on that day?
No.
So isn't it fair to say that Keith Sandy never ordered anybody to do anything? Isn't that correct?
He never told them to do anything, no.
Excuse me for my writing, but I think Keith Sandy never told anyone to do anything, right?
He never gave them an order, no.
He wasn't in a position to give any orders, was he?
No.
Keith Sandy wasn't a sergeant at the time, right?
No.
In fact, at the time, of that, if you will, just for the sake of using this term, that arrest team, the last few people that were up there. In other words, Keith Sandy, who was lethal cover, Officer Weimerskirtz, who was holding the dog, and Acting Sergeant Ingram. The person with the most seniority on that day was actually Acting Sergeant Ingram, right?
That's correct.
There was another sergeant out there named Sergeant Carpenter, correct?
Yes.
And eventually there was another sergeant named Sergeant Fox, correct?
Yes.
Okay. So eventually we've been told, and we see all these pictures, that 19 officers came out to the scene, correct?
Yes, those 19.
So let me ask you if you believe this statement is true. What was the crime that merited this kind of response? Illegal camping. Now, is that a true statement?
No, that's not why they all came out there.
So if it said, if the statement was, what was the crime that merited this kind of response? Illegal camping, that's what these people were called out for, would not be correct, would it?
No, only Officer McDaniel and Hernandez were initially there for the illegal camping, or supposed illegal camping.
Okay. Let me ask you if this statement is accurate or true. Speaking of Mr. Boyd now, this was before he was shot.
You're not going to object to this form of question. I think it is improper because.
Speaking of objection, Your Honor, just based on, I don't need to approach Your Honor. Let me ask you about this statement. If you believe this is correct about Mr. Boyd, he's encircled, this is right before he's shot. He's encircled, he can't escape, he can't get away, he can't harm anybody. Is that an accurate statement?
No.
So, do you know whether or not it was a man or a woman up there previously with Mr. Boyd, previous to this whole incident?
I don't know for sure.
So this statement would be incorrect as far as you're concerned. Why we know he was with a woman up there is because Alexander Thixton photographed both of them from his balcony walking around. Now, question is, did you see any pictures from Alexander Thixton that absolutely identified this other person as a woman?
I couldn't tell for sure if it was a woman or not.
How about this statement? Speaking of Mr. Boyd, he had gone on to town and he had gotten a little thing of Church's fried chicken, and he was sitting in his shelter, such as it was, in his home, watching a video on like a little device, watching a movie. Now, was there ever any evidence that you discovered that Mr. Boyd had just gone to Church's fried chicken?
I never explored if he did or not go to Church's.
But you're not aware of any information that he had just been at Church's fried chicken?
No.
And tell me, you're not aware of him watching a movie in his shelter?
Except for the statements that he made during the time that he was watching or wanted to watch a movie, no.
Okay, and he didn't have any device to watch a movie with, did he?
I don't know if he did or not. I don't remember seeing one.
Okay. So, we're talking about the open space officers. Is this statement true? They both pulled their guns on him, not because he did anything wrong. Is that correct?
The reason they pulled their guns was a show of force. They couldn't see his hands, and they were obviously concerned, especially when they saw the knife in his pocket.
Okay. Let me ask you if this is a correct statement as you understand it. This is, again, against APD policy, which says if you suspect somebody is mentally ill, don't touch them. Try to avoid contact with them because people, particularly people who suffer from schizophrenia, don't want to be touched, and that touching them can set them off. Is it an APD policy that you are not allowed to touch someone who is mentally ill?
No, it's not a policy.
When dealing with the police, speaking of the open space officers, tell me if this statement is true. They spin him around to frisk him. Did the two open space officers spin Mr. Boyd around to frisk him?
They went to do a pat down, but I never saw if they actually spun him around, and it was only Officer McDaniel that was doing the approach to do the pat-down.
And you don't know, you don't have any information that they actually spun him, do you?
I don't think they physically spun him, no.
So the words "they spin him around" is not a correct statement.
I don't believe so.
Now, when you hear the words defensive posture, and based on your training and experience in law enforcement, when an officer says defensive posture, that also means aggressive posture, doesn't it?
Means that probably a fight's coming, yes.
So, would you agree with this statement? So after the CIT officer arrives, calms him down, not only did he stop pulling out his knives when Michael Monette is there, he stops completely. Is that true?
I guess I don't understand the stops completely part.
Okay. He never was compliant with what officers were asking him at that point.